Edward VIII was the king who abandoned his crown for love. That's the story we're told. A tragic romantic. A man who sacrificed everything for the woman he loved. But history tells a much darker story. His reign was short, but it was brutal. His secrets ran deep. And when his younger brother died, Edward's reaction wasn't what you'd expect from a grieving man. In fact, it was so disturbing, so cold, that it still raises questions about who Edward VIII really was. This is the chilling truth behind the king who walked away. The unexpected death of Prince George. It was August 25, 1942. Britain was in the middle of World War II. The country was under attack, the future uncertain. And then, another tragedy struck. Prince George, Duke of Kent, the younger brother of Edward VIII, was killed in a plane crash in Scotland. His death was sudden, violent, and shocking. At 39 years old, Prince George was one of the most controversial royals of his time. He had a wild, scandalous life filled with rumors of affairs, drug use, and even secret government connections. Some even whispered that his plane crash wasn't an accident. But when the news reached Edward VIII, who was no longer king by that point, his reaction was not one of grief. In fact, his reaction was nothing at all. No tears. No public statements of sorrow. No sign that he had lost his own brother. It was as if nothing had happened. And that silence was deafening. While the rest of the royal family mourned, Edward went about his life as usual. The man who had once been the King of England didn't even bother to return home for the funeral. Instead, he stayed in France with Wallis Simpson, the woman he had given up his throne for. Even his own family was stunned by his coldness. For years, Edward had been distant from his brothers, but no one expected this. When he did speak about George's death, it wasn't with sadness. It wasn't with warmth. It was with annoyance. According to some reports, he even complained about how the tragedy had disrupted his peaceful life in exile. A man had lost his brother. And all he could think about was himself. That wasn't just shocking, it was inhuman. But this wasn't the first time Edward had shown a complete lack of empathy. His entire life was a pattern of coldness, selfishness, and even dangerous alliances. Edward VIII was king for less than a year. And yet, that short time was enough to show the world what kind of ruler he really was. He was reckless, dismissive, and dangerously uninterested in the role of a monarch. Winston Churchill and other officials begged him to take his duties seriously. But Edward couldn't have cared less. He mocked the traditions of the monarchy. He ignored political responsibilities. And worst of all, he was openly sympathetic to Nazi Germany. That's right. Edward VIII had secret meetings with high-ranking Nazis. He admired Hitler's leadership. He even considered making peace with Germany while Britain was preparing for war. It's no wonder that when he abdicated the throne in 1936, many in the government were relieved. Because keeping Edward as king could have meant disaster for Britain. We've all heard the romanticized story, how Edward VIII gave up his throne for love. But let's be honest. This wasn't a selfless act. It wasn't about sacrifice. It was about him. Edward had always been selfish. Always put his own desires first. And his obsession with Wallis Simpson wasn't about love, it was about control. He didn't care about duty. He didn't care about responsibility, and as it turns out, he didn't even care about his own family. His reaction to his brother's death proved that. Because in the end, Edward VIII wasn't a tragic hero. He was a cold, indifferent man who turned his back on everyone, his country, his family, and even the people closest to him. And history will never forget it. Edward VIII, the man who gave up his throne for love. That's the story we've all heard. A king so hopelessly devoted to Wallis Simpson that he abandoned everything, his power, his country, and his duty, for the woman he loved. It's the kind of story Hollywood dreams are made of, but the truth? The truth is far darker. Because Edward VIII wasn't a tragic romantic. He wasn't a hero. He was something much more chilling, selfish, reckless, and disturbingly indifferent to human suffering. And when his younger brother died, Edward's reaction exposed something so cold, so callous, that it still raises questions today. How could a man show so little emotion over the loss of his own blood? And was this shocking moment just a glimpse into something even more sinister? Let's dive into the story the royal family would rather you forget. August 25, 1942, a shocking royal death. The world was at war. Bombs were falling over London. And Britain was fighting for its very survival. But then, another tragedy struck the royal family. Prince George, Duke of Kent, the younger brother of Edward VIII, was killed in a mysterious plane crash in Scotland. He was just 39 years old. And his death was brutal. George had been a pilot in the Royal Air Force. On that fateful day, he was flying in a Sunderland flying boat with 14 other men. But something went terribly wrong. The plane crashed into a hillside, killing almost everyone on board. The details were murky. The cause was unclear, and rumors started swirling immediately. Had there been a mechanical failure? A tragic accident? Or was there something more sinister at play? Many believed George's lifestyle had finally caught up with him. Because unlike his older brother Edward, Prince George wasn't just a royal, he was a scandal waiting to happen. Prince George, the royal family's biggest scandal. Before his untimely death, Prince George had built quite the reputation for himself. He was charming, handsome, and endlessly reckless. His affairs were legendary. He had been romantically linked to both men and women, including famous actresses, socialites, and even high-ranking officials. There were even rumors that he had been involved in drug use, a shocking claim for a member of the royal family. Some whispered that his death might not have been an accident at all, that he had enemies, that there were people who wanted him gone. But while the world mourned the tragic and sudden loss of the Duke of Kent, there was one person who seemed completely unmoved. His own brother. Edward VIII's disturbing reaction. When Edward VIII, now living in exile in France, received the news of his brother's death, people expected sadness. Grief. Something. Instead, they got nothing. No tears. No public mourning. Not even a hint of sadness. And when asked about it, Edward didn't even pretend to care. According to reports, he was more annoyed than anything else. He didn't want to be bothered. He didn't want his quiet life with Wallis Simpson to be interrupted. And most shockingly, he didn't even return to Britain for his brother's funeral. Let that sink in for a moment. A former king. A man who was once the leader of his nation. And he couldn't even be bothered to show up for his own brother's funeral. What does that say about him? What does that say about his humanity? If this had been an isolated incident, maybe people could have excused it. Maybe they could have said, grief affects everyone differently. But this wasn't the first time Edward VIII had shown a complete lack of empathy. It was a pattern. As king, he had been shockingly indifferent to the suffering of his people. When Britain was struggling through the Great Depression, Edward VIII, who was still king at the time, famously said, "Something must be done." But he did nothing. When he met with impoverished families, he showed no real concern, no real desire to help. And then there were his connections to Nazi Germany. This was a man who openly admired Hitler, who secretly met with high-ranking Nazi officials, who once suggested that Britain should make peace with Germany, even while Hitler was bombing his own people. It was disturbing. It was dangerous. And it was proof that Edward VIII's loyalty was never to his country. Only to himself. The world likes to tell the story of Edward VIII as a man who gave up everything for love. But let's be real. Edward didn't sacrifice his throne. He threw it away. He never wanted to be king in the first place. He hated responsibility. He hated duty. And when he was forced to choose between his country and his own desires, he picked himself. His reaction to his brother's death was just the final, undeniable proof of that. Because when the people closest to you die, and you feel nothing, that's not love. That's not tragedy. That's who you really are. Edward VIII wasn't the hero of a romantic love story. He was a selfish, arrogant, and deeply cold man who cared for no one but himself. And his reaction to his brother's death was just another reminder that some royals, no matter how much history tries to romanticize them, are not worthy of admiration. But what do you think? Was Edward VIII truly a tragic figure? Or was he one of Britain's most heartless kings? Let me know in the comments below. And if you love uncovering the real truth behind history's biggest scandals, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because trust me, there are so many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop questioning the stories we've been told.